The romance that got Dandadan started is actually hurting its characters. It's weird because YouTube was flooded with Dandadan is a romance videos last year. I should know since I made the biggest one. But while I boldly praised Dandadan's romance before, now I almost wish it would go away. Romance is the whole reason series creator Yukinobu Tatsu got the idea for Dandadan, but now it's just getting in the way of the characters. As other fans are starting to notice, whereas romantic rivalry was an interesting source of tension in early Dandadan, now it's making some of its characters redundant. Obviously, the problem there is that the romance between Okarun and Momo is the driving force of the story. So if you take that away, then you're left with nothing. But if you're caught up on the manga, then you know there's been a big change in the story. That's why I'd like to analyze that change, discuss how it solved one of Dandadan's only real flaws, and explain why Tatsu needs to kill the romance in Dandadan. Just be warned that there will be spoilers. Now obviously the problem with moving away from romance is that Dandadan is and always will be a romance. Romance is what inspired the story in the first place, and it's the driving force for Momo and Okarun. So if you somehow cut out the romance, then you would ruin the story by eliminating one of its most important factors. And while YouTube has driven this point into the ground, it's undeniable that Okarun and Momo have a chemistry unlike what you'll find in most anime. In fact, you wouldn't have Dandadan without the romance. Part of the reason this manga stands out is because it has two main characters. There was a bit of a debate for a while whether Momo or Okarun was really the main character, but it's really both of them. It's not the first time it's ever happened. In fact, Undead Unluck is one of my favorite manga, and it has a very similar premise. But a story with two main characters, especially characters that are more or less romantic partners, is fairly uncommon. So part of why Dandadan is so charming, and why it's able to stand out so well, is because of its premise alone. But unlike other mainstream anime, Dandadan also stands out because it starts out with the romance, not the action. The first episode is literally titled That's How Love Starts. It starts out with Momo looking for her own knight in shining armor, or I guess Ken Takakura in Golgo 13 cosplay, and it starts with Okarun wanting someone to talk to, and everything that follows is a direct consequence of this dynamic. Dandadan was criticized in its early days for not really having a story, but that's because it didn't have a big plot in the beginning. The entire plot was based around Okarun and Momo and their growing relationship. Even the Evil Eye arc, the first big arc in the series with creepy villains and scary worms, that starts with Okarun meeting his first romantic rival, fighting to protect Momo, and Momo showing Okarun how much that means to her. It's from this relationship that we meet the other main characters and we get all of their backstories and cool powers. And it's thanks to all of this that Dandadan has one of the best casts in any anime. And that's what I mean when I say if you completely take out the romance, then you're putting an end to everything that makes Dandadan special. But that was before. That stuff already happened and it's not going anywhere. The anime is catching up, but the manga has gone in a new direction in the last few years. And the same formula that made Dandadan special could eventually ruin the story and its characters. But before I say more on that, make sure to check out my next live stream if you're enjoying the video. I stream every week, 3 times a week, and I even review Dandadan every Monday. But like I was saying, early Dandadan had a clear formula for introducing new characters. For the most part, every character that would later become a member of the main crew was introduced as a romantic rival. Ira had a big crush on Okarun, Gigi was Momo's first crush and competes with Okarun, and oddly enough, even the alien girl Vamola serves as a romantic rival for Momo. But Vamola is sort of the last time this happens. At this point, most of the characters in the main crew don't pose a threat to the main relationship. Kinta is Kinta. Zuma has a few moments where maybe there's something, but he's clearly not a rival for Okarun. Rin isn't a romantic rival, and the newest member, Koki, just wants to play piano. And that's not considering all of the side characters we've met. Dandadan has an ever-growing list of characters, so at a certain point it became impractical to have every new character pose as a romantic rival. And obviously after a while it got kind of old. Funny enough, this is kind of how people feel about the the original romantic rivals. Some fans still find Aira annoying because she continues to flirt with Okarun. And even worse, some fans just don't like Gigi because he repeatedly tells Momo that she's precious to him, even though she never really reciprocates and it never goes anywhere. And I say it's worse in Gigi's case because ever since the Space Globalists arc, he hasn't had any real growth. Back then he learned some spirit powers, but that was basically it. Since then, he's been one of the most redundant characters in the story. He's continued his training, but we haven't seen any new abilities. He almost never uses Evil Eye anymore, so it's barely like he's a spirit hybrid. And like I said, he continues to make these desperate gestures for Momo. In fact, most of what we get from Gigi is him repeatedly confessing to Momo. It never goes anywhere. He never does anything to make himself stand out. It's sad because I like Gigi and I think he has a lot of potential, but he's painfully redundant and his desperation makes him one of the least relevant characters in the story. It's actually gotten to a point where he's kind of becoming the butt of a lot of jokes in the new chapters. In the current arc, the main crew hops on a plane. This is the first time our new character Zuma meets the other characters besides Momo. And after just meeting him once, Gigi tells Zuma that he wants Zuma to have nothing to do with his friends. It's kind of a minor moment, but it's actually an example of regression for Gigi, because this is the exact opposite of when Gigi was introduced. When he was introduced, Okarun was all self-conscious, but Gigi said anyone who was Momo's friend is his friend as well. It was a moment that clearly defined Gigi's chill vibe and friendly personality, something that motivated him to care for Evil Eye and to basically become Vamola's big brother. But then Zuma is introduced, and Gigi does a complete 180. In his defense, Zuma is a delinquent, but he's never done anything to put Momo in harm's way. The only reason Gigi acts this way is because of his feelings for Momo. But instead of his usual older brother energy, we get a bratty child that almost feels like a completely different character. This results in Zuma coming out as the bigger person, and later one-upping Gigi several times throughout the arc. Clearly, Tatsu needs to change Gigi's role in the story. He was great as a romantic rival before, but now his desperation is holding him back, making him one of the least interesting characters in the story. If this continues, then he'll see little to no growth in the story and fans will actually start to hate him. It's exactly because of stuff like this that I'm saying Dandadan needs to move away from the romance. It makes characters like Aira annoying, and in Gigi's case, it actually makes him one of the story's weakest characters. Now, like we said before, we still have the problem of romance being the core of the story. So if you take that away, the story as a whole would feel pretty empty. That is, unless you replace it with something else. And that's exactly what Tatsu's been doing for the last few years. Remember how I said early Dandadan was criticized for not really having a story? That was back when the romance was the main focus. Well, following the introduction of Vamola, romance begins to take up less and less of the narrative. After we meet Vamola, the main characters are attacked by aliens. This is when we find out that the same army that attacked Vamola's home planet is coming for Earth. So the characters have to team up, go through some training, and fight what can only be described as an Avengers-level battle against an alien invasion. Granted, we still focus on the growing relationship between Momo and Okarun. We still have moments where Aira flirts with Okarun. And we even get a moment with Gigi and Momo, which I honestly hate. But that shares the spotlight with all of the crazy stuff going on in the plot. The result is that we get one of the best, if not the best arc in the entire story. Essentially, Tatsu keeps the relationship between Momo and Okarun relevant while making the plot outside of that relationship increasingly more important. And this continues into the next arc where the characters get trapped in this fantasy world and they have to fight another army. We reach a new level in that main relationship, but it's only one part of the story that also includes new characters, a big battle, and the introduction of what seems to be the big bad of the entire story, the person who set every event in motion, which sets up the current arc perfectly. In the last year or so, we really haven't focused that much on Okarun and Momo's relationship. It's still relevant, but Tatsu's focused more on growing the other characters and introducing new characters like Koki. And of course, the main focus right now is learning about the big bad and finding out about his evil plans. The romance is still there, but for the first time since the beginning of the story, it feels like one of many things going on in the story rather than the entire story. And despite what you might think, the story is better than it's ever been. Obviously, this isn't to say that moving away from the romance saved the story or something, but by fleshing out the other characters and focusing more on the big mysteries in the plot, Dandadan has become a more thrilling story with more interesting characters. When every character doesn't have to be a romantic rival, we get a huge cast of amazing characters that all offer something special. I keep bringing her up, but one of the best examples of how this change opened up Dandadan's potential is Koki. Koki is introduced as one of the main villain's lackeys, but once she's defeated, we find out that she's actually pretty cool. She has a tragic backstory, and the villain used Koki's past to manipulate her. We also find out that Koki used to love playing piano before she lost in a big competition. And what do you know? The person she lost to was a young Ira. Fast forward to the more recent chapters and we watch as Koki gains back her powers and gains this really cool piano-based ability. She goes from the painfully shy lackey to elegant, inspiring musician. Now, part of why I use Koki as an example is because I think she's awesome, but another reason is because of how immediate her growth was. And here's what I mean. So Koki is introduced in chapter 168. That character growth I mentioned happens in chapter 187. In other words, Koki has had more character growth in less than 20 chapters than Gigi has had in over 100 chapters. Mind you, in those 100 chapters, we've met a ton of really cool characters like Koki and Zuma and Payase and Kashimoto. We've also seen some nice growth for Vamola and Kinta and Rin to a lesser extent. Plus, we even have a new character arc for Turbo Granny, which I'll leave at that since it's a pretty big spoiler. All of this happened in the span of 100 chapters, and none of it had anything to do with Okarun and Momo's relationship, or any romance for that matter. The story has grown exponentially ever since Tatsu decided to grow the story beyond the main relationship. Clearly, the story has grown and is better than ever because of this, but as many fans may argue, this does create a new problem. And funny enough, it's a problem that Dandadan has already solved. See, with so many mainstream anime, it's hard to stand out if you just follow the same battle shonen formula. You don't need to reinvent the circle, but you should add some kind of twist. In Dandadan's case, this was the romance. Like we talked about before, Tatsu didn't revolutionize the usual formula, but he started it in a refreshing way with two main characters that stand out from everyone else. The reason Dandadan stood out so much in its early story is because it has all of the crazy powers and silly fights, but it tethered that stuff around the romantic struggles of Okarun and Momo. Now, like we just explained, you can still have a great story without relying on the romance, but the concern that people will have is that Dandadan will become a more generic story as a result. It's the kind of complaint you see when you look at stories like Sakamoto Days or Kaiju number 8. They start out with a unique premise that's really fun, but soon become just another battle shonen with no real character growth, which in any other story would be a perfectly legitimate concern. But as we can clearly see in Dandadan, this has only made the story better. It's made the villains better, especially the big bad. It's allowed Tatsu to flesh out the side characters in meaningful ways. As a result, each character offers something different and we get a well-rounded and diverse main cast, where each character is our favorite character. And it also allows for even more fun characters to be introduced. The key isn't so much to completely remove the romantic elements. Rather, what Tatsu has done is relied less and less on Okarun and Momo to carry the entire story, and slowly made it so that it is one of several reasons people look forward to the new chapters. Before, it was really just about those two, but now it's about them, and the other characters, and the plot twists, and most importantly, how the big bad will set up the next big arc of the story. And to those people who still say this moves Dandadan away from its initial premise, the truth of the matter is that Dandadan was never a true romance, at least not in the traditional sense. Even when Okarun and Momo carried the story and people said there was really no story, it was obvious that there was a plot that was only going to get bigger and bigger. Dandadan is less of a rom-com like Kaguya-sama, and clearly more of a battle shonen like Undead Unluck. Another good comparison is Eden Zero. Eden Zero starts out with Shiki and Rebecca, but it's always clear that they are not the only thing driving the story. And the same is true in Dandadan. Now more than ever, Tatsu has freed himself up to focus on a bunch of different fun elements, and there's multiple factors driving the story. As a result, Dandadan is one of the few ongoing manga that consistently gets better and better while still staying true to what made it special in the first place. Even if we change the narrative focus, we can still make Okarun and Momo's relationship a driving force of the story while also building everything else. That is exactly why Tatsu should continue to balance out the narrative while still building on the same premise that everyone loves. But maybe I'm wrong. Should Tatsu focus more on the romance? What changes would you like to see? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And don't forget to watch my next live stream and become a channel member. Members get custom badges and emojis, they can pick which series I cover next, and you can even get credited in future videos. Also check out my other Dandadan videos, which you can find in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.